Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behaviour nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behaviour geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behaviour nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. You'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behaviour geeks. But we will get started on today's episode where we'll be talking to one Megan LaFollette. Dr. Megan LaFollette works with the North American 3Rs Collaborative to advance science, innovation and research animal welfare. She has her PhD in animal behaviour and well-being from Purdue University, where she has also received a Master's of Science in Animal Welfare. Her primary interests lie at the intersection of human-animal interaction and animal welfare, especially in practical refinements for laboratory and companion animals. These interests have led to her conducting projects focused on rat tickling, compassion fatigue in laboratory animal personnel, refinement for cats in confinement, positive reinforcement in training horses, the welfare of service dogs, and human behaviour change for animal welfare. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Megan to the show today, who is patiently waiting by. Megan, thank you so much for taking the time to come and hang out with us at Animal Training Academy.
Of course, I'm so happy to be here.
And I was so focused on saying your name correctly, I think I completely butchered Purdue. How do you say that? Purdue University?
Purdue. No,
Purdue.
you did fine.
Ah, nice. And I want to give a shout out before we get going to a previous ATA podcast guest, Autumn Sorellis, for connecting Megan and I. And I love to hear in your bio there, Megan, about you focusing on compassion fatigue in laboratory animal personnel. It's something Autumn spoke about, and she said that she's had people reach out to her after the podcast recording to touch base on that. So considering your focus on that, she focused on that in our talk, it's an important area. I'm assuming in all animal care, but particularly maybe in your industry?
Yeah. So compassion fatigue in laboratory animal research personnel, I think, is very prevalent because of what makes that field unique. So people who work with research animals typically really love animals. That's often what drove them to get into the career. Many of them have pets. Many of them have maybe adopted animals. So they love animals, but at the same time, often in order to conduct research, they have to inflict some amount of pain, suffering, confinement, etc. on these same animals that they care for. And that causes them some amount of moral or emotional distress because, they love these animals, but they also believe in animal research. They know that this is how we get new therapies for humans and animals alike. But it can be challenging to not be able to do everything you want for the animals in your care. And then beyond that, a lot of times the animal research field is heavily stigmatized. People, look down on people who are working in animal research and, have a lot of moral qualms. And so rather than being, celebrated for the caring work and the hard work that these research animal people do, instead, sometimes society, sometimes even family and friends just look down on it, don't respect it, don't understand. And so it's a challenging field to be in, and a field where, there's a lot going on. It's a big thing with lots of different, many moving pieces.
Yeah, well, as of a month ago from the time of this recording. By the way, it's November, everyone. I don't think this will be in your ears until January, but at the time of this recording, as of 2 months ago, we didn't have any content within ATA on welfare and training in laboratory settings, and now we've had Autumn on, we're getting you on, and I'm reminded as you talk then about just this last weekend we had Autumn join us live in our membership and talk about some of her work, and she asked people what they thought of when they thought of laboratory and animal research for the exploring, as you said, important new areas of therapy for humans and animals. And myself and a few others said our reference points are movies, and she cited a few really salient articles that I think one in Life magazine and one in Sports Illustrated that really shifted perception. And so it's just making me think as you talk that community is really important for us to get this information out, that you guys are doing these amazing things.
Yeah, there's actually right now a push. There's been a push in Europe previously, but right now there's a really big push in the United States, the United States Animal Research Openness Initiative, that another nonprofit, not mine, but Americans for Medical Progress, is really helping to facilitate institutions becoming more open about what they've done and what they're doing and the great things that animal research is used for, because again, the general public often gets very little exposure to it. And what exposure they get is often misrepresented. There's a lot of groups out there that are actively trying to end animal research. And in the past, it's been that there have been some really some high-profile, kind of scary animal rights incidents where people who either breed animals for research, who are conducting animal research, they get hate mail. There's been bomb threats. There's been stories, like true stories of people having the remains of family members stolen by animal rights people. And so it's been really extreme. And so that is why, in the past, people haven't been as open because they've been really scared about what could happen to them. They're scared of judgment, etc. Things are getting much better. Those types of animal rights activity have really gone down a lot. But people who've been in the field a long time remember that or have heard those stories. And so that's prevented people from being open in the past is because of just the pushback. And it is a complicated issue. It's one where it's not black and white, where there's some grays. I mean, most people that work in the field will probably tell you that there are some ways that the animals are housed or certain experiments that they don't love, that they wish could be better. But sometimes they can't be. There's obstacles in the way. It's not a simple story necessarily. It doesn't have simple black and whites. Well,
I think it's important to share. One thing that I took away from Autumn's presentation is that their team provided some data sets that said we don't have to deprive animals of water to get the results that we need for our medical research. And so it came across to me that maybe there's a bit of cultural fog there. This is the way we've always done things. And you guys are kind of using the knowledge and skills you have and bringing them into this industry and sharing it. And hopefully that's going to make those who might feel isolated and suffering from that compassion fatigue understand that they're not alone. Is that important for you? Is that how you see?
Yeah. So I work at the North American 3Rs Collaborative. We're a nonprofit focused on advancing science, innovation, and research animal welfare through collaborative 3Rs efforts. And we have several different initiatives. Really, our ultimate goal is to to improve the lives of research animals and replace them with new technologies whenever scientifically appropriate. And we really try to find initiatives and find ways where we are seeking continual improvement that have evidence, that have impact, that have practicality to help people make the switch, because making change is hard, as we all know. And actually, one of our initiatives is focused on compassion fatigue. We are in the process right now of we're creating what we're calling a institutional starter pack for institutions that want to have compassion fatigue resiliency programs. And in this January, we're actually doing our first pilot of that program, where we're going to be having, for the institutions that are participating, I think there's at least 5, we're going to have monthly webinars. We're going to provide them with activities, recommendations for trainings, for managerial, for policy changes, stuff about budgets, committees, a whole host of resources. Because in the research animal field, compassion fatigue is a big topic, especially after the pandemic and everything that animal research caretakers had to deal with at that time. But there's more and more desire for it. And ultimately, we believe, and we see it in our own eyes, that, the more that you take care of your people, the better that they can take care of the animals. Because at the end of the day, we need those people to be doing the procedures, to be advocating, to be looking for new, better ways to do things. And so I actually have conducted a study, and we have some data showing that human welfare and animal welfare truly are intertwined.
It seems like an obvious thing to say. It's good to have some data sets behind it, though, of course. And congratulations on everything that you've achieved with 3Rs Collaborative and these new pilot studies. That's an approximation worthy of celebrating. Fantastic. I'm curious to know how you got to be working in this organisation that you've just briefly brushed over then, and I would love to learn more. But to learn that, I'd love to go right back. Can you take us back to where you got started getting interested in training or animal welfare or whatever area you see as the starting point, a starting approximation for your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, neither of my parents had ever had pets. They really were not, quote unquote, animal lovers by nature. My dad grew up on a farm. They had cattle, they had outdoor cats, outdoor dogs, but not much. But I personally, just from the time I was little, I always loved and was attracted to animals. My parents would find me at the neighbor's house playing with the neighbor's dog. And, I'd beg and beg for a dog. I'd beg for horseback riding lessons, all of that. And then finally, for my 13th birthday, after I had given up all hope, they surprised me and said, "We're going to the shelter. Let's pick out a dog for your 13th birthday." They had some qualifications. It had to be a year old. It needed to be potty trained and together, but I was so excited. I actually, before I got this dog, and this is probably one of the reasons they got it for me, is I was a kid that I went to the library and I checked out all the dog training books. I checked out all the animal books. Even though I didn't have an animal, I would just read them for fun. And really for positive reinforcement training, as I'm sure many of us in the field found it this way, as I read Don't Shoot the Dog by Karen Pryor. That, classic book really made an impression on my little teenager self of, wow, this is so interesting. It's so fascinating. It totally made sense to me how she walked through operant conditionings and different ways of getting behavior, and kind of made the story that, positive reinforcement is a really, there's lots of ways, but positive reinforcement is a really great way. And so that's how I even got into animals to start with. And then for the longest time, I thought that I wanted to be a veterinarian. I did good in school. You go to your high school counselor, you say you love animals, you get good grades. They say, hey, you should probably be a vet. So, so that's what I thought. I'd spent a lot of time volunteering, interning. I was very involved in college in the equestrian team. I took equine reproductive classes, all of that. And then I studied abroad in the Fiji Islands, which may seem totally unrelated. But before I studied there, I was very ultra focused, ultra high achieving. This is my goal. I'm going to get it. And then I realized that, you can slow down. There's more to life than just, getting ahead and just careers. It's, just slowing down, enjoying your life. And I started to realize that if I went into veterinary medicine, that I could see myself being so committed to my patients that I wouldn't feel like I could take a day off, that I didn't feel, I could see myself working very long, putting too much into it. And at the same time, I was shadowing. I was realizing on the day-to-day, I didn't love the work. I was realizing how much debt you go in for veterinary school with not as high of starting salaries as are great. Later, I also learned about the suicide rates being really high in the veterinary profession, and basically realized that was not actually the place for me. So this was probably my junior year of undergraduate. I had to make a pivot. Luckily, I had already been doing a little bit of research in my mind to strengthen my veterinary school application, which I was no longer applying for. But that actually led me to my very first animal behavior project, which was trying to basically prove some of the horse field wrong, that if you train horses with treats and positive reinforcement, they won't just mug you for treats. That's was kind of the common knowledge that I was hearing from the trainers at my facility. It is, well, you can't give horses treats to train them. They'll just constantly be digging in your pockets. They'll be biting you, etc. And I knew from my previous work training other animals and just the literature that if you trained correctly, that was not the case. So that was kind of my first foray into formal animal behavior research, was this project, trying to train horses just to touch a target, just a basic. And I had a little chart with, successive approximations of training them to touch a target. I had a very strict protocol to try to eliminate bias on my part. And then I just measured their behavior before and after training. And I'm sure none of the listeners are surprised that the horses actually decreased the amount of mugging related behaviors pre-post and didn't increase. So that was kind of the start of my foray into the world.
And that was some research you did?
Yeah. So as an undergraduate, we had undergraduate research projects because I was at a small liberal arts and sciences school that didn't have graduate students. So we had just these little projects that we could design and go for. And that was what I wanted to do, because we had a farm. We had an equine farm there with about 30 horses, the university did. So I had a pretty decent sample size, and pretty much none of them had been trained with positive reinforcement ever. So they were a naive sample, which was good for the research.
And so that's your undergrad little project. You defined it as, it's not something that's, can the members, so the listeners of the show see your work anywhere, or?
So that research is still 7 years later, not published. I will say it was not the most high quality of experiments, being an undergraduate who had no applied animal behavior researchers at my institution to guide me. That being said, it's theoretically on the goal list for 2021. But yes, that is is pending. But if you go onto my website, you can see a little bit about the project and about what we did. We did also, and by we, I mean I and the other undergrads I worked with, we did also do a follow-up project where we directly compared positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement in training horses to go through a quote unquote scary object, which is we just did 2 jump standards with pool noodles through the middle that would brush the horses. And that project actually found that it took about the same amount of time if you apply positive or negative reinforcement properly, but that with positive reinforcement, you saw less undesirable behaviors like rearing, like shying away, etc. So yeah, you can find a little bit on my website, and hopefully one day it will get published.
So this was at Purdue University, or this is at a different?
This was at Truman State University, where I went to undergraduate, which is in northern Missouri. It's a small, only about 6,000 students, liberal arts and sciences school.
Because Purdue is quite a large institute, isn't it?
Yes. Purdue is about 40,000 students in Indiana.
And what's your website? I don't know if I've visited that.
Yeah, so I just have a small little personal website. It's meganlafollette.weebly.com. Haven't paid for the domain upgrade yet. That's my personal website. That kind of goes through a lot of my work up until my work at the North American 3 R's Collaborative.
Cool. And so that was your soon to be published. I'm just winding you up. Soon to be published on your website, undergrad research. But you took obviously all of your learning from that and all of your experience, and you've gone on to do more research before you ended up at 3 R's. Can you talk us through some of the other research you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started off graduate school researching cats in confinement. And the idea was to think about cats that are in shelters or cats that are in veterinary clinics, although certainly this could also apply to cats in laboratories as well. And basically the research project was focused on, seeing how cats react to being in confinement, seeing what would help them. This was a very short-term project. I had worked with one advisor, and it just didn't work out with that advisor. So I ended up switching, but I did get to learn. I got to read a lot about cats, which, a lot of people have pet cats. It was really interesting to read the body of literature on them. And one of the things that the woman that I was working with at the time really impressed on me, and her research really showed, is that it actually, the entire room that the cats were in mattered more than the cage itself. And what I mean by that is having a room that is quiet, that has a regular schedule, that, overall is well designed, was actually more important than what was put in the cage itself. That being said, cats in confinement do really benefit from having a hide box. By having somewhere to hide in their cage. Those are some of the takeaways. But if you are interested in that work, I did write 2 white papers that I believe are on my website. And if not, if you just look for Purdue Cats in Confinement and my name on Google, you should be able to find it. And they've got some recommendations for shelters or veterinary clinics that are looking for that information in a very easily digestible form.
Wonderful. And then we'll try and link to some of that in the show notes maybe. And your last research, your PhD research, am I understanding correctly, was on rat tickling?
Yes. So both my master's and my PhD research was ultimately on rat tickling. So many of you are probably wondering, what the heck is rat tickling? I promise you, I did not make this up. I did not even coin this phrase, but I can explain it to you. So basically, when rats are young, they actually have rough and tumble play that's very similar to the way that young puppies play with each other, where they're chasing, they're wrestling, one's pinning the other on the back. And just means similar, at least, to the way that you would play with a puppy, that you may like roughhouse a little bit with a puppy, you can do with a rat. And this work has actually, this technique has been used in over 60 different published experiments. And one thing that's really exciting and really, I think, fascinating is that when rats are tickled, as well as whenever rats are experiencing positive emotions, they make ultrasonic vocalizations in the 50 kilohertz range. And this is really considered like the gold standard of measuring positive arousal reward in rats. And they make these vocalizations when you tickle them. They also approach you more. They generally show less signs of stress. They're easier to handle. They react to handling better. And so originally, rat tickling was developed. It was actually developed in the field of neuroscience by Dr. Jaak Panksepp, as well as his doctor, Jeffrey Bergdorf, who are considered the fathers of effective neuroscience, so the study of human and animal emotions. They developed this technique as a tool in neuroscience because they wanted to study positive emotions. But I worked with two advisors, Dr. Brianna Gaskell, as well as Dr. Sylvie Cloutier. Dr. Sylvie Cloutier worked under Dr. Jaak Panksepp, and they were really interested in using this technique that was developed kind of as a means to an end to look at positive emotions, and instead use it as a tool to improve rat welfare. So not as an outcome measure, but as an intervention itself. And so my master's and my PhD really went through the process of, first of all, is there really strong evidence for this technique? Because so many people, especially when you call it rat tickling, are very skeptical. So first, I wrote a systematic literature review that showed there was over 55 papers that showed there was so much strong evidence. It also showed there's a lot of variability in response, but that the variability on the whole was positive. Then I was really interested in, do people actually use this as a technique in the lab? So I conducted a large-scale benchmarking survey of over 600 animal research personnel in the United States and Canada. Found out no, they don't use it. I was interested in understanding why. I used a theory called the theory of planned behavior that kind of explained it. I coded, I mean my interns mostly coded qualitative data. Thank you so much to my undergraduate interns. I can't do without them. They coded that data, found out a lot about the barriers, and then I found out that really people weren't doing it because of time, because standard protocols had you tickle rats for 2 minutes a day for 5 days, which, if you have one animal, you're like, oh, great. Yeah, of course we can do that. But imagine you have 72 rats in a room and you have 5 rooms. That adds up really quickly to a lot of time. And again, people may want to do it. Again, these lab animal personnel, they may read that and they may think, oh man, I'd love to do that, but I literally don't have the time in the day to do that. And so I conducted a project looking at what was the least amount of time that you can tickle a rat and still get beneficial results. And I found that it only took 15 seconds for 3 days to get the same beneficial results as the 2 minutes for 5 days. And that's a lot more realistic. That's a lot more doable. It's still extra time, but it's a lot less. And then the final project I did about rat tickling was focused on training, actually. And so this was actually aptly timed pre-pandemic, but is very applicable post-pandemic because I created a online rat tickling certificate course, which any of you can access. It's just bit.ly/rat tickling certificate. I'm sure a link will be provided in the show notes. And it takes about 30 minutes. And so I did a formal longitudinal study comparing people who either had no training in the method only had the online training or had the online training. And then I also came in with my advisor and my committee member and taught people hands-on how to do the technique. And then we compared their implementation, their knowledge, their attitudes, etc., and found that on the whole, there was really no difference between just doing the online certificate course and us coming hands-on, which was really exciting, and probably was really due to the fact that that certificate course has so many videos, has so many pictures, really goes into how to do technique, where people get tripped up. And we really put a lot of work into that. And since then, I've actually had people somewhat regularly either email me or come up to me in conferences and tell me that they are now tickling their rats and what a difference it's making for them. So that is so rewarding. And also, too, if you're just looking for something fun to do for yourself or with your kids for 30 minutes, I encourage you to check out the course because you get to see lots of cute videos of rats.
So let's say I have 30 minutes to spend with my kid and I want to take this online course. What am I going to learn in a course? How does one tickle a rat?
Yeah. So the course goes through really everything you want to know. So first it starts off on why we should even tickle rats. Like what the heck? Well, first it's like, what the heck even is rat tickling? What are the key components? Because there's actually 3 key components. There's dorsal contact, a flip, and a pin. So you go through why, then you go through how. So flipping the rat over is actually the most challenging part. So there's quite a bit of content on different ways to hold the rat, to do the flip, etc. It also goes through in the why part, the evidence for it, what benefits there are. And then it also goes into more details of how. So if you have a particular study, how do you do it in the timeline? How old should the rats be? What time of day? What type of rats should you not do it? And then there's the other key section that's really important I have a section in there that's about reading your rat. So evaluating whether your rats are enjoying the interaction or not enjoying the interaction. Because in my research, the first couple days, sometimes they're a little bit confused, but really after that 3rd day, you should be seeing positive reactions in your rats. And if you're not, we say you should probably stop, and that's not for them. So yeah, it goes into everything, almost everything you'd want to know, how to record, how to set up the cages. Lots of frequently asked questions that people have, does the strain matter? Does the gender of the person tickling matter? What type of research is it good for? Will it affect their research model? All sorts of questions. So, yeah.
So what does flipping a rat look like? Is it what's written on the can?
No, so it's basically I tell people to imagine so if you imagine a rat, and then you imagine how you'd pick up a person underneath their armpits. You basically do that with a rat. You pick them up underneath the armpits, and then you kind of like use a little bit of momentum to flip them over and pin them and tickle them on their belly. So,
and so it's flip a rat, and I can imagine it would take a number of days because the rat's initial reaction is probably going to be like, whoa. Do they feel vulnerable initially? Do you find when they get put in that position, or is there a genetic tendency to kind of associate that with rat tickling?
Yes. Well, so the reason that rat tickling works is these two key, it's the 2 key components, the pin and the dorsal contact, that are ingrained, ritualized part of rat play, kind of like a play bow in dogs. They're just these signals that rats give to each other. But of course, we are not rats, and rats know we are not rats. And so, but it's surprising. There's some rats that you tickle on the very first day, on the very first time, and they are like, so some people colloquially call their 50 kilohertz vocalizations laughter. There's some evidence for them being analogous to human laughter. And some of these rats, very first time will be laughing like crazy. Will just totally be into it. Other rats, it does the first day, they're like, what the heck are you doing? But what I always remind people is that ultimately, you're not hurting them. Like, yes, they might, like, even those first few days, maybe they're not super comfortable with it. But if you think about in the grand scheme of things, of what types of procedures that we do for laboratory rats, that even if a rat does not end up loving tickling, it probably still prepares them to have future handling by humans. And most rats will be handled in some way from humans. And this at least gives them some sort of experience that was not did not end up with an injection. It did not end up with getting their blood drawn. But most rats, I will also say this technique is recommended for juvenile rats because this is when their play peaks. You want to be careful. You don't want to tickle rats that are too much older, especially if they've already had negative human interactions. It's best as kind of that like baseline. One of the first things we recommend people do with their rats is, often rats will be shipped to your facility, let them, get used to their new homes for a couple days and then start tickling so that that first interaction they have with you is positive versus if you have, some people have rats in their labs that, they didn't know about tickling and they didn't know. And so their rats are already a little bit, cranky. They've just been restrained, they've been injected, and we don't recommend tickling those rats. So you do have to apply. That's why there's a course, because you do have to apply it carefully.
Well, if you listening don't get excited or joy from just the thought of a rat laughing, then I don't know what to say. Is there anywhere on your website or online you can hear a recording of? I need to know what a rat laughing sounds like.
Yeah, so I will send you a YouTube video that we have that you can hear rats laughing. And you see the tickling. You can see the tickling and hear rats laughing.
And so for someone at home who wants to tickle their rat, maybe they have a pet rat, is there something you can do with an adult rat or not at all, just for juvenile rats?
So it's something that it depends on the personality of your adult rat, as well as how much you've handled them in the past. If this is a rat that you've had all their life, they've had extensive handling, they're very chill, they already let you handle them a lot, then you can definitely try it. That being said, because they're adults, they may or may not enjoy it that much. It's kind of like, often humans kind of age out of when tickling is fun. And, tickling in humans is not quite the same thing. But even rough and tumble play, wrestling, there are only some adults that still enjoy wrestling as a form of play. And so if you want to tickle your adult rat, just make sure that you're paying attention to how they're responding. And if you do, if you have an adult rat that, maybe rescued or, it doesn't really like to be touched, don't try to tickle them. Like if they like bite you because that's a thing already, like just don't. This is not going to make it better. This isn't a cure. It's a preventative. It's something that you do to kind of help rats be more comfortable with handling from the get-go. It's not something that you do to fix handling problems after they've developed. I'm sure all of you guys know it's way easier to prevent a behavior that we don't want to be established than to fix it after the fact. And this is definitely an example of that.
And so you walked us through a flip, and then you've mentioned the pin and the dorsal contact. Can you walk us through those components as well, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the dorsal contact, if you do want to tickle your rat, you go on the back of the neck, in between the shoulder blades, and you just make a little tickling motion with your hands. You kind of Goldilocks it. You don't want it to be too aggressive, not aggressive enough. You want to have like a firm contact. One thing with the dorsal contact is you want to avoid the rump, the area near the tail. Research shows that is where aggression is directed between pairs of rats. And ultimately, we want to do play, not aggression. So stay up by the shoulder blades. So you do that for about 3 to 5 seconds, maybe. Then you pick your rat up to flip it. I will say some rats that are super playful, especially when they're very young, will flip themselves. It just kind of depends on the individual. And then you do that same tickling motion in between the front legs. Sometimes you can actually even kind of shake the rat lightly. It sounds kind of ridiculous. But if you can actually buy, if you're like super into this, if you have rats and rats are your passion, I recommend you get a bat detector. There's a company called Magenta that sells them. Bat detector, not rat detector with a B. But what this allows you to do is this allows you to measure ultrasonic vocalizations. And so you can set it to 50 kilohertz. And these things go for maybe like 80, 100 US dollars. So they're not, they're pricey, but they're not bad. They're an investment, but you can use that and you can listen for their ultrasonic vocalizations. And then you can know. And so that's why I say, the shaking is it feels kind of silly. But again, if you look at rats playing with each other, or you listen to the vocalizations, that when you shake them, when you kind of make these motions, they make a lot of these positive vocalizations. And so it's always nice if you are into rats a lot that you get this equipment. In the laboratory, there's even more advanced microphones where you can visualize these calls, and they actually have, I think, over 13 or 14 different subtypes. You can look, there's a whole line. It's really fascinating looking at ultrasonic vocalizations in rats. And they've actually used them to discover new anti-anxiety and antidepressant drugs using tickling and using these vocalizations, because rats that are anxious or depressed will not make as many of these vocalizations. And they're a very clear-cut, fairly objective, relevant measure, outcome measure to look at in the field of neuroscience. It's very exciting.
And you mentioned earlier that you demonstrated that for 15 seconds a day after 3 days, you can start to see positive reactions. What do you see? What observable things do you see in the rats that you're using to measure this?
Absolutely. So the number one thing is that gold standard ultrasonic vocalizations. As you see their ultrasonic vocalizations skyrocket after 3 days. But you also see in my study all of the other measures go up as well, or at least most of them. So things like approach behavior. We looked at anticipatory play behavior in the cages. So basically, if you tickle your rats at the same time of day, each day, they learn, okay, when this person walks in the room, this thing is going to happen. And usually if that thing is a good thing, they're going to be more excited. They're going to be moving about the cage, getting pumped for it, essentially. And so we can look at their behavior in the cage and see that before they get tickled, they're having more of this positive anticipatory behavior. I believe we also saw more in calls. We gave them a intraperitoneal injection just of saline, just to mimic a common laboratory procedure. And they respond much more positively to that, or at least, actually, I'll just say a lot of these, it wasn't that those that were tickled for 15 seconds versus 60 seconds were more positively, but there was just no difference. You couldn't tell from the data a 15-second rat to a 60-second rat. So if you looked at their vocalizations during the injection, during the 15 seconds of tickling, during their behavior in the approach test, in their anticipatory or reactionary cage behavior, it all looked the same. And so really the takeaway is it's not so much how long the interaction lasts, but that you've done it, and that you've done something, and that you've done it short. And in fact, I also advocate that I think the shorter is better, because then even if you do have the odd rat that really doesn't like tickling, you're only doing it for 15 seconds. So even if they don't like it, it's a short interaction that's over quite quickly. And I will say, like, in this project, I had 72 Long Evans rats, and a couple months after the project was done, I was going through the rats to try to find one that didn't like tickling, to make some recordings for this rat tickling course, because I wanted people to be able to see a rat that was not having as good of a time during it. And I had to tickle almost every single one of those rats to try to find one that didn't like tickling, so that I could record a video of that behavior to show it to course participants. So if you're tickling them the right way, at the right age, for the first time, it really is positive to almost all of them. And even that rat that responded negatively, I went back and tickled her later, and she was fine after that.
So would you even go so far to say that it's a need for rats, and therefore I'm just thinking, if it's a need and those needs are met, does that impact research and results that you get in research?
Yeah, so I wouldn't go as far as saying it's a need, at least for socially housed rats. It is something that if, you have to, usually rats are required to be socially housed unless there's a very particular strong exception reason for it in the research. So I do say for isolated rats, if at all possible, you should be tickling them. And I also say, and I think it's true, that the better, that if you have rats that are stressed during handling, that it can impact your results. We absolutely see this. There's been a lot of work done in the past 10 years on what's called tunnel handling of mice. Traditionally, research mice are picked up by the tail. And there's a really big push. The North American 3Rs Collaborative is helping advance this on getting people to switch to using tunnels or cupped hands. And there's been a lot of really strong research. Dr. Jane Hurst in the UK has really led this, showing that some behavioral tests do not work if you pick mice up by the tail. There's this really interesting habituation, dishabituation test where mice are basically sniffing urine. And if it's a new urine, they should be sniffing it longer than if it's an old urine. And if you pick them up by the tail, they won't interact. They won't even sniff the urine. It looks like you didn't do the test. The test doesn't work because they're very anxious from being picked up. But if you pick them up correctly, then you see these results. They perform this test correctly, and then you can use that to ultimately study your research paradigm. And so in rats, there's similar sorts of thing. If you're looking at, trying to measure that has something that has anything to do with stress, if your rats are more stressed, or if you're trying to run a behavioral paradigm with rats, they're going to perform differently if they're anxious or if they're stressed. And also they're harder to handle. It's less pleasant. If they are harder to handle, we hear, from people from facilities that have switched to rat tickling, that it really makes a difference, particularly in their training animals, for people who are new to handling rats, and they're learning how to do injections, they're learning how to do procedures, that the rats are just much more friendly. It's more pleasant for the people. It's better for the animals. That all being said, there are definitely situations where, I wouldn't call it a need and I wouldn't recommend it. So there are going to be some models where the rats are very sick. And if they're very sick and they don't feel well, they probably don't want to be tickled because it is an exciting, fun thing. And so there might be models where you might tickle them when they're young before you induce that disease state or, whatever you're trying to study, and then you stop tickling them later. But I usually recommend you should at least establish that initial positive human-animal interaction and that positive human-animal relationship before you move to your model. And sometimes in the models, it may not be appropriate, depending on what you're studying.
And we talked about mice there, and I mean, logically, that once again, it just all makes sense, doesn't it?
Yes.
Is tickling something that's unique to rats, or is it something that's seen in other rodents or other small mammals?
Yeah, no. So it is, I often get asked in my rat tickling workshops, can we tickle our mice? And I tell people, no, please do not tickle your mice. Your mice will bite you, because mice do not have the same social play as rats do. Rats are pretty unique in this like quite stereotyped, like regular type of rough and tumble play. That being said, if there are ways that we can help elicit play, co-play with animals, promote play in animals, that is probably going to be positive. We just need to make it species specific. We need to not assume that just because rats like it or because we think they'd like it. So for example, petting, just because we like to pet soft, furry animals, we shouldn't assume that the animals we are petting enjoy it. We need to, think a little bit more critically about that. And so it's really about finding what works for that animal. Certainly there's animal behavior principles that apply, establishing positive relationships, that baseline principle of that positive relationship stands, but the specific rat tickling interaction does not.
And is it across all species of rats? But this is the second, I'd say, rat podcast episode we've done. The first one was with African giant land rat, pouch rats with a popo.
Yeah.
And is it across all rat species? Do you know, or is it?
So I have never had the opportunity to tickle any other strain of rat. I will say that the rats that we use in laboratories are domestic. They are pretty domesticated. They're actually, I think they're the longest animal purpose bred for research that we use. They've been bred for research, I want to say, for over 200 years. And so they are, and typically our domesticated animals tend to have longer play periods, be more willing to play longer. So if you're looking at a rat that does not have those features, they may not benefit from the interaction. And I know there are certain, I've not interacted with them personally, so I can't speak to them much, but I know there are certain even strains of rats that are considered highly aggressive. And those ones may not interpret it well because, this is play fighting that we're kind of mimicking. And so if you have a strain or a type of rat that is more fractious, as we might say, it might be a little more risky to tickle those animals because they could interpret it as fighting. I will say that it was almost going to happen, but then the pandemic came along. I almost worked with a researcher that was interested in trying to tickle her 13-lined ground squirrels that she had in her research animals research lab, because she looked at their play and they had play that was like rough and tumble wrestling play. And so we were and these are animals that in the lab get very aggressive and very difficult to handle. I keep saying aggressive. I should probably just say difficult to handle later in their lives. And so she was interested in that, but unfortunately the pandemic came around and travel, I need to get in contact with her and find out if she ever tried tickling her 13-lined ground squirrels.
We don't have squirrels in New Zealand, so now I want to also see juvenile squirrels playing because that sounds incredibly cute as well.
It's really cute.
You said earlier that it's not a cure, it's a preventative, and you also mentioned that rats are required to be socially housed. But with those two thoughts in mind, why is this so important to this species in particular in animal research?
To be housed socially?
To have their welfare considered. My understanding is that rats, mice, birds in research have different considerations for their care than some other species?
Yeah. So it depends on the country you live in and the accreditation agency that you're working under. But one of the international ones is ALAC, and they do cover mice, rats, but they cover all animals, and most of the bigger, pharma company, et cetera, are going to be ALAC accredited. And in the United States, we have something called the Guide. It's the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals that lays out a lot of principles for animals. And the majority of species, it does I believe it actually requires social housing if you have a social species. And this is because when you think about an animal that spends its entire life in a cage, the most enriching thing that you can provide that animal is another animal, because that other animal is inherently variable. It's going to be doing different things. The other animal, if it's a social species, is often going to elicit species typical natural behaviors, and typically social species, this is a need for them to have social companionship. And there has been a lot of work about the importance of social housing for social species, and rats in particular are quite social species. Mice are actually a little bit less social. They still are required and should have social housing, but rats are very social animals. And that means they need a social companion. I mean, it's kind of like people. One of the most, damaging things you can do to a person is solitary confinement, as a form of torture, as a form of anything. And one of the things that research shows again and again is that our feelings of social support are predictive of not only our mental health, but also our physical health for people. We're highly social, but so many other species out there are social as well.
Cool. I didn't know about a lot of those things. Hey, where can people go to find out more about rat tickling, 3R collaborative, and everything you've talked about so far? Where can they go online?
Yeah, so for the North American 3Rs Collaborative, which is really everything I'm working on now, which I haven't even really gone into, it's na3rsc.org, na3rsc.org. And then for rat tickling, for mice, and actually on that website, you can find out about rat tickling. We actually have a resource page for most of the most common laboratory animal species. So we cover mice, rats, guinea pigs, hamsters, dogs, pigs, zebrafish, and non-human primates. I believe that's all that we have for now. So you can find out about rat tickling on there. You can also go to my personal website for rat tickling, horses, cats in confinement information. That's meganlafollette.weebly.com. The rat tickling certificate course directly is bit.ly/rat tickling certificate.
Hey, wonderful. And we will link to all of this in the show notes as well for you listening so that you can easily find it online. Hey, thanks so much for sharing everything, Megan. We love hearing about people's behavioral odysseys, and we haven't heard a behavioral odyssey about rat tickling before. So that was a ton of fun. I had so many questions about rat tickling. We've run out of time for today. So we're going to head to the end. Megan, I'm curious to know, what would you say your big dream is? What do you want to eventually look back on your life's work and feel proud that you managed to achieve? And what legacy do you want to leave behind? What's the dream? And what do you want to see happen over the coming years with your work and the work of your organization?
Absolutely. So I really am passionate about the research animal welfare field. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in the field, and that I would love to see, looking back however many years from now at the end of my career, and to know that I played a part in helping institutions make switches, make changes, do things that ultimately helped the welfare of their laboratory animals. I would love to see more, one of my passion is human-animal interaction. So seeing more positive positive human-animal interactions, positive reinforcement, better handling of research animals, better housing. There's so much work. It's just an incremental change for the research animals that we have. I'd also, that's really the refinement piece. I really do want to see the reduction piece of the 3Rs, where experiments are being designed to be robust, that have really strong statistical analysis, where, I've worked with other organizations and have helped more people design these robust, reproducible experiments that are really maximizing the data per animal used. And then finally, I'd love to see more and more technologies being developed and then actually implemented that replace animals altogether. So, one of my initiatives, or two of my initiatives, are focused on replacement right now. We're seeing some animals being replaced with PCR technology. The big thing we're also looking at is organ-on-a-chip technology. I'm really excited to see where that technology goes, and I'm excited to hopefully play a part in getting more institutions to use that, so that we reduce the amount of animals that we need in animal research altogether, and we can just make their lives better, less stressful, and just reduce the total number that we even need, because we've developed some of these amazing replacements. Just kind of seeing that overarching application of the 3Rs within the research field would be amazing.
What is PCR technology?
So polymerase chain reaction. So basically the short story is, we used to use, traditionally, and some institutions still use, what are called soiled bedding sentinel rodents as sort of you can think of them as a canary in the coal mine, where you have a whole room full of mice that you're using for an experiment. And you want to make sure that those mice do not have some sort of other background pathogens, illnesses, bacteria that's going on with them. And so traditionally what they do is they'd have just like one cage of mice in the corner, where they take the dirty bedding, the soiled bedding from those main research animal cages, and they dump it in, and then they test those sentinel animals periodically, ultimately euthanizing them to make sure that there weren't something like the mice get what are called fur mites. They get like an ectoparasite, or, there's not something else going on in that room. But now, because of the amazing technology that humans have invented, we can instead test the dust from those cages, or transfer that bedding but have like a piece of filter paper in that. And then the filter people can pick up little bits of DNA from those parasites. And then you can send that off to a lab, and they can then use PCR, polymerase chain reaction, to, in my understanding, amplify that DNA and detect those pathogens without ever having to have these sentinel canary as a canary in the coal mine type mice, and just replace them, because of this technology that we just didn't even have, 20, 30 years ago. And just now we're really realizing, we can use this, and it can be effective if we do it correctly.
So the sentinel mice is those mice living out those lives, and no more need for them. Obviously there's always going to be a need for live animals, but the three R's mission is to reduce, robust. Have I got the second one right? Robust. What? Remind me.
So it's refinement, reduction, and replacement.
And that is what's written on the can. That's what that organization's goal is. What is that?
Yes.
Like written in their mission statement. Like, what is? If you were to give an elevator pitch of the 3Rs right now, how would you sell that or help someone understand?
Yeah, absolutely. So I basically say refinement is trying to improve the lives of research animals that we must use. So improving their housing conditions, reducing the stress of procedures that they might have to undergo, making sure that they're transported well, they're bred well. There's all aspects of an animal's life when we must use them. Reduction compassion is about using as few animals as possible while maximizing the amount of data. So traditionally, people used to think about this as just like, the fewest animal possible per experiment. But we know now that that is not, it's worse to run an experiment and not get good data because you didn't use enough animals to detect a true result. We want to make sure that the experiments we run in our modern interpretation of that is using good statistics, using good experimental design, using things that are reproducible so that when we do use animals, we're getting good results. And then the last R, replacement, is about replacing animals altogether, or in some cases partially, by new technologies. So that's like the PCR, that's like organ on a chip. In some cases, it's using animal cell lines that may come from, non-traditional sources. So, can we take animal cell lines from agriculture? Can we, do something of that manner? And then sometimes it could also mean using invertebrates. But generally, a lot of it's newer technologies. These organ on a chip systems where we're actually growing miniaturized organs that have multiple cell types that are arranged in a 3D structure. Those hold a lot of promise. There's also computer modeling. There's all sorts of ways that we can replace our laboratory animals. But we need to make sure that those replacements are, in fact, valid and robust and scientifically appropriate, because we do want to ultimately ensure that the medications and that the techniques and procedures that we're using for the medical field work and that they're safe. That's really what, there's certainly more basic research that we do with animals, but a lot of our animal use is to try to develop therapies to help animals or people that are sick and help them without causing additional harm. And developing new drugs and developing new therapies is hard. It's complex, and we want to do it right. And so that's why we do it, but we want to do it right. And we think that using the 3 Rs have been around for over 50 years, but we do think that these are principles that are key to humane experiments.
I don't think anyone can argue with that. And I hope that the listeners of this show have learned a lot today. I definitely have, and can appreciate and be grateful for the work of your organisation, and excited about it and the future for the animals involved, and lots of reasons to be grateful for those animals as well, and the contribution they give to everyone. And I'm so curious for you, like what's your KPI? How do you know you're being successful when you're going about your day-to-day, year-to-year, month-to-month?
Yeah, so really the ultimate key progress indicator for me is about, hearing is what we want to see is we want to hear from institutions that are saying we changed our practices because of, or in part due to materials that you put out, whether it was the website, whether it was a talk, whether it was, compiling the evidence or connecting people. I want to hear that people are changing their practices in a way that is 3 Rs related. So saying, we've actually in the past year and a half, we've had 6 different institutions reach out to us and say, we are switching to what's the PCR technique. We're no longer using sentinel animals. So across those institutions, that's over 8,000 rodents that will not need to be used for every year going forward. So I want to see that. I want to see more institutions, saying, we do not pick up our mice by the tail anymore. We use tunnels. More institutions saying we have a compassion fatigue resiliency program because of what you've done. We're using microphysiological systems to do research earlier. So we're having less animal lives that we're having to test these drugs on, and just, this continual hearing back. And I see that with the rat tickling already, which I did in graduate school, is I'm hearing more and more, institutions and people saying, we're using this is making a difference. And that's the ultimate aim for me and is so rewarding.
I can imagine. I got a ton more questions, but we've run out of time. So, Megan, I've had a ton of fun learning about rat tickling today. I am inspired. I'm full of appreciation and feeling very thankful for the work you're doing. I just feel for those 8,000 mice per year. There's not just that. You said 8,000, right? 8,000 sentient rodents per year, and that's just one project. So that in and of itself is something that definitely needs to be celebrated. From myself and on behalf of everyone listening, I mean, we really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behaviour geeks. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.